Okay, we're looking at Timeflow. This is a Java application that we downloaded. It's an open source project that is a data visualization tool. It takes some data and plots it on a two-dimensional chart. Can be used by reporters to track events through time so that they can use data visualizations to write their stories. So what we've done here is we have pulled in the code into our primitive engine, and what we're looking at is a layout of the directory structure here. So we see there's the Timeflow package, and then we're seeing all of its child packages, and then their children as well. So we can look through some of these packages and start exploring some of the code. We can start with the app package. This is the main package that the application uses to initialize. So if we look down here, these two classes, this one is the launcher. This is where the public static void main is. Creates an instance of this, which is the main application. This is extending from JFrame, which is part of the Swing library. So it's just a frame that the application's going to use. Actually open this up and look at some of the fields and methods inside of this class. So we have one version of the constructor here, and then here's the actual, I think, overridden, well, yeah, this is the first piece of code that gets called here. Yeah, so we can take a read through this and see all the elements that are going to get created. And actually run this code as well, so we can actually see the story of what happens here inside of this piece of code. You can see that here in 3D we can really appreciate the sort of verbosity of this particular method. You can really look at the whole thing like this Star Wars scroll here. It's kind of fun to be able to actually look at all this code on a 3D space. So we're actually going to run this so you can actually see it go step by step. It's a better way of understanding how it works. Let's see some other methods here. So you can see we're also visualizing the arguments that are getting passed in to these particular methods and also their return type. So this one is a good example. It's this load method. It returns a void, so that's what this tetrahedron represents. And it's going to take a couple of objects. It takes a Boolean, which is this cube, read only, and then it's going to take two other object types, importer and file name, passed in. So we can see the equivalent over here, what that code ends up looking like. And then we can also look at the methods that this class uses. So we have model, file chooser, splash, examples. These are all, again, object types that are used by the program. Okay, so this is going to be the starting point of the code, and we'll actually look at that in the runtime. I might actually just point out maybe one other class here. So we could look inside of views class. This is just one example of some elements that we're going to see later in the initialization of the program. So some of these classes are going to be used to actually manipulate the data. They're kind of fun to look at. So we can look at, first of all, the methods. So when you are switching views on your visualization, you might want to look at a bar graph. So you'd call this method. It's going to pass in the model that you've drawn, and then it's going to do a layout. It's going to set sort of the boundaries of the graph. It's going to give you some functionality for scrolling through it, and then it's going to put the visualization on the top of the display. So, and then here are some of the fields associated with all that. It's nice to just be able to lay out this code in a big environment like this, just because you know, this is 14,000 lines of code, this program. It's, you know, just very quickly can orient yourself in this world because we have all this freedom to do so. Okay, so enough of looking at the static code. Let's actually run it. So I'm going to flip our visual or engine over into the runtime mode. And what you're going to see here is a thread getting drawn from the outside world to our public static void main, which is the launcher we were talking about earlier. You actually start stepping through the code here, and we're going to see some objects getting drawn. So a couple here. We're going to see that Timeflow app. That was the application we were looking at. We're seeing its constructors getting called. And the first thing that happens is it creates an instance of this TF model. That TF model's constructor gets called, and it creates an instance of display. Display then gets created and starts initializing some values. So we're going to see some field values getting assigned here. There's font name, there's plain font, huge font, big font, bold font, tiny font, time label font. So a lot of initialization happening in some strings. I'm going to actually skip over this and then start looking at the next set of objects getting created. So we see here a couple others, app state and about window. These are other controls early on in the initialization of this program. They're going to be responsible for like quit actions and menus and things like that. You see here actually pointer value getting assigned to one of these fields. So about window is actually pointing at the TF model. And we see, again, when we do something like a quit action, this actually ends up cleaning up the data on some of these objects we've seen. I'm going to keep it running, and now we're going to flip threads. Now we're on the, so we were on the main thread, which is this blue one, and now we're on the secondary thread, the AWT event queue thread. So this is where a lot of graphics initialization is going to happen. Just going to let this guy play. So we're just going to see the whole setup here of this model. Said really we're seeing the story of the code. We're actually seeing all the objects that are getting loaded into memory, and really seeing the general structural layout of how the program's designed. A very powerful way of laying out lots of information in 3D space. And we're seeing a lot of initializations happening, so object might get created and then some values, some field values are getting assigned or accessed in this case. And then this thing's going to run for about, well, it goes through about 2,000, two or 2,500 events here. So we're going to see that next here a couple minutes. Notice that everything is anchored on the Timeflow app. So the Timeflow app is actually a factory for a lot of these objects. And that's what these line associations are telling us. This is, it's telling us who created what. Also notice every once in a while the thread will actually drop back down to either the black box, which is the outside world, to access, let's say, a library function, but it'll also drop down to the lower layer, which is where all the static methods are inside of classes. So you might want to be accessing some static method to, you know, compute something. So it's helpful to think about everything that's above the ground is loaded objects in memory, and everything down here are static references that can be called at any time from anywhere. So you see some static activity over here and more objects getting created. Notice too that every time an object, every time a class gets instantiated, it's actually rising up from the ground and entering the model. Just seeing a lot of objects getting created here, and stack trace looks interesting right now to see, so we can follow it through all these different methods. A lot of graphical elements being loaded. There's time scale, dotted lines, a slider. This is all the initialization. We're going to actually look and see this Timeflow application after it gets launched here. Getting there. Okay, we're just inside of a library right now, so we're gonna be doing some swing library calls, and now we're back out. And cool, looks like we're all initialized. So right now we are stopped on the TF model. So that was the second object that got created in this whole paradigm here. And we're on get display. So it looks like we're we're probably displaying the information right now. We can actually look at what this application looks like on our screen. It's not displayed here in the 3D environment, but we see, and I'll attach a picture of this, the actual Timeflow application when it loads, what it actually looks like. You can also interact with the running Timeflow application. It's running on JVM. We interact with it, and I'll pass over information over to this world so you can actually see the associations, the corresponding associations inside of the code. Okay, great. So this is a fun project to look at. It's really simple, just 14,000 lines of code. So you can wrap your brain around it pretty quick. It only takes a couple minutes really to just look at how the initialization sequence works and what the object model ends up looking like. So we think this is a very powerful way of onboarding to something like an open source project very quickly by being able to actually immerse yourself in a 3D visualization, as we can do here with Primitive. All right.